The discovery of a potential new orca population in oceanic waters. That's the subject matter of today's episode. We have Josh McInnes from the University of British Columbia, who's doing his master's thesis. He is here to talk to us about this new paper that he published. It's exciting. I can't wait to start. Let's start talking about killer whales, orcas. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is a podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And on today's episode, we have a special one, folks. We have Josh McInnes from the University of British Columbia, who's here to talk about his research, a number of different pieces of his research on orcas or killer whales, especially on transient populations and the discovery of a potential new population of orcas in oceanic waters, so in the high seas. We're going to talk about that research. We talk about how he got into studying orcas, how he was also works on a whale watching boat, or he worked on a whale watching boat, how he also worked to do whale watching lectures on orcas on these boats that were people paid to go on and learn more about the ocean and about where they're going in the Arctic and Antarctic and all this wonderful stuff. And he also talks about his research and why he did a master's so long after his undergraduate degree. There's a lot of great stuff in here if you're looking for careers, if you're looking for discovery of new populations of orcas, just all things orcas and why it's important to talk about them, what's impacting them, how to protect them. All that stuff is in this episode. So here's the episode. Here's the interview with Josh McInnes from the University of British Columbia talking about orcas on the Pacific coast of North America. Enjoy, and I will talk to you after. Hey Josh, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about orcas and dolphins and research and protections, all that wonderful stuff?
Oh, thanks for having me here, and absolutely, I'm really stoked to talk about all this, all the research and everything that's happening in the killer whale world.
Oh man, that's going to be awesome. I'm super excited. So we kind of connected over LinkedIn, which I love LinkedIn, by the way. I'm not sure if you use it a lot, but I love it because it just allows me to get access to a lot of people. It feels like it's just like a friendly, collaborative kind of platform. But we connected over LinkedIn because I think it was you that posted an article about, killer whales, orcas getting protected status in the state of Oregon, which was great. It for some reason, it kind of caught me off guard. I was like, why weren't they protected in Oregon? And I didn't really realize that there was an Endangered Protection Act Endangered Species Act in Oregon. So I don't know why I didn't think that, but it was great to see it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, the importance of that. Obviously they're protected federally, so we'll talk about the differences, but really just talk about that resident population, just even some of the populations over, on the West Coast of North America, and just get into it and talk about some of your dolphin research as well, and get to know a little bit about you. So with that said, Josh, can you just tell the audience who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a marine ecologist. My specialty is behavioral ecology of marine mammals. And most of my life has been kind of working with whales as kind of my focal species. So I grew up on Vancouver Island, British Columbia. So that's over in Canada. And it's kind of an area that's kind of historic for killer whales. It's kind of where it all began. A lot of the research that was first initiated in the 1970s on killer whales was around Vancouver Island. And so I was kind of surrounded by it. Like literally, you look out your window and there's this big strait called Johnstone Strait, and there's killer whales like daily going through there. And then in every wall, newspaper, there's killer whales printed on and painted on. And so for me, it was kind of a no-brainer. So I started working with killer whales in 1995. And then I started doing research on killer whales. I started as a tour guide, and then I ended up getting into research in 2005, about 10 years later. And so now I'm working at the University of University of British Columbia. I went to the University of Victoria, but I'm at UBC
Okay.
now, and I get all these academic institutions confusing. But I'm at UBC now in the Faculty of Institute for Oceans and Fisheries, where I study transient killer whale behavior.
Which is amazing. I mean, UBC, University of Victoria, they're both internationally recognized and amazing universities, and putting out great publications from fisheries to marine protected areas to behavior, all that wonderful stuff. I do have a couple of questions from what you mentioned regarding sort of your history and sort of your development within sort of the research world. It's interesting for me. Orcas seem to be part of the culture of BC, right? And correct me if I'm wrong. Like, it feels like not only from the indigenous populations, the many different nations in BC, but also from sort of a Canadian perspective, Canadian citizen perspective, where it's always been entrenched. For you growing up in BC, like on Vancouver Island, what was that like? Were you always fascinated with orcas? Did you see orcas? Like, did you do the tours when you were younger? Is that like a thing there? I'm from Ontario, so I don't, I don't know. I've been to Victoria. I've never been on the tours. But I'd feel like if I was a kid interested in oceans, I want to be on those tours. Was that part of the culture there for you growing up?
It was huge. I mean, like you said, between the indigenous people that are here that have the utmost respect for killer whales and
Hmm.
orcas. I started. Like I said, in 1995, I really enjoyed watching killer whales. That was kind of, I'd go outside and walk down to the beach and you'd see them, and I really wanted to get involved in. I was reading every single book you could possibly think of as a kid on orcas, and I ended up joining a whale watching company when I was 12, and
Oh,
I
cool.
take people out on expeditions. My parents had to sign actually to let me work because that's almost illegal, having child slavery. So I ended up having to get a signed permission, and I worked a few summers doing that. And then later on, I ended up leaving the North Vancouver Island. I moved to the South Vancouver Island and other areas along the island to kind of pursue whale watching and other aspects. And then I said, one day I just decided it was time to get into research. I had too many questions that I wanted to answer. Um, Behaviorally, I thought killer whales were fascinating. They're super smart, super intelligent. Some of the things I was
Yeah.
seeing when I was on the ocean was just incredible.
What, like, can you kind of tell us like one of the things or a couple of the things that you saw before you went into research that really made you think, oh no, there's something different about these orcas?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing that ingrained in my brain the most, I was I was fishing off a dock when I was 12. My cousin and I, we were off the North Vancouver Island, a town called Port Hardy, and we were fishing, and we got just place at the right time. We were in a good place at the right time, and basically a group of white-sided dolphins, which are a species that we typically see on the Pacific coast here. Um, a big group of them came into this harbor, into Port Hardy Harbor, and we were really excited, like, oh, dolphins, this is incredible. And as the dolphins came in, they kind of dove and disappeared, and we looked at the mouth of the harbor, and a big black fin just kind of cut across the mouth of the harbor, and we were like, "Oh, it's a killer whale! Like, what's the chances of a killer whale and these dolphins on sea?" And then,
Yeah.
literally, I had like jumped out of my skin almost because all of a sudden the water just like exploded 100 feet from us, and this one killer whale just chucked this dolphin through the air. I mean, it threw it probably 50 feet through the air. Another dolphin died, well, basically stranded itself on a beach and died.
Because they're so
Right,
afraid. Oh
yeah, right
man.
in front of us. We were just like, holy cow. And by this period of time, like everybody in the town, like this small town, were like gathered taking photographs. I mean, there is a picture I think somewhere showing the dolphin being thrown in the air, and it was in the newspaper. And about 2 weeks later, I got invited from the Canadian government, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, as a student. I was 13, I think, at the time. I got invited to come do the necropsy on the dolphin that died. So that's an autopsy of an animal.
Wow.
So after that, I was pretty much hooked. I think I learned that these were transient killer whales. I learned about the different kinds of killer whales, and after that, that was pretty much it for me. I was addicted.
Well, yeah, it's not hard to get addicted to learning about it, especially if that was your introduction to them, like live. Like, that's just insane. I mean, now we see the videos. I just think there are more people out there now, observing killer whales and watching them, what they do in their behavior and just their intelligence, and just seeing the way they do things. And it's just phenomenal. Now, transition, how old were you when you decided, okay, no, I'm going to go into research, and this is going to be my passion, this is going to be what I'm going to do for the rest of my life?
Well, I think I was around 17 years of age. I had been I was a bit of a bookworm, and I was reading a lot of papers from a particular scientist that I kind of admired growing up. It's Robin Baird, who's he's a
Oh yeah.
famous cytologist. Yeah, um, and it was I kind of connected with him on many different levels in his work because and now he's not so much into killer whales as much anymore. He's more in Hawaii doing research on dolphins,
Yeah.
but before that, he grew up in the same town I did. I mean, he was in Victoria, BC. We went both to the same schools. He went to Camosun College and University of Victoria, and then
Hmm.
he also studied killer whales and we both were interested in the same kind of killer whale, which were transients. And he was a
Yeah.
behavioral ecologist, which was super cool. So it's kind of wild. I after he would kind of finished off with killer whales and his research through Simon Fraser University, I kind of picked it up and continued it off southern Vancouver Island. And I actually ended up going out, getting boats, and I'd spend time by myself with the killer whales, just sitting there taking pictures and writing notes while I had these orcas swimming around me catching seals. So it was a really cool time. I mean, instead of some people in their early 20s would be out partying, I'd go out in a boat and just literally look for whales all day long and then sit with them and watch them. So it was pretty cool.
It's not a bad time, like not a bad way to spend your time, to be honest, right?
I totally, it's a good time. I have some fond memories, and I made some really good friends, and it was a great place to really get my initiation to this kind of research.
It's really interesting too because you did this during your undergrad, right? Like you were out doing the observations. So what made you? So what I find really interesting is you were reading papers, like journal articles from Baird and other people. I'm assuming while you were doing this whale watching or working with the whale watching companies. I assume that was throughout high school. Was that throughout high school? Yeah.
Yeah, throughout high school and then into college. I mean, I took some time off after high school before I went to my undergrad, and I basically
Right.
just read papers and tried to see best of my knowledge. I even started like a non-profit group with a couple of friends and to study killer whales, and that's kind of how we kind of branched off into our own thing.
So where did you get like first like what made you start reading the journal articles and then where'd you get access? Because we know sometimes it's not easy to get access to those papers.
Yeah, so luckily, I mean, Google Scholar is such a great. I mean,
Yeah.
there's lots of free access papers through there. I mean, some of them I just got friends that were in school that to give me those papers. At the time, I had read a few books. I mean, one of my favorite books was from Baird was Killer Whales of the World, which was published in
Right.
2002. Great book, and I knew that he had written academic papers based on that book, so I went to those. And then every single time I read a paper, I'd go to the references and just start looking for the papers that were
Start looking them up.
he referenced or they those people referenced.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and it's kind of interesting actually. Just on that note, it was a few years later. I was into my undergrad, finishing off my undergrad, and I was doing a talk at the University of Victoria just before I was, finished my undergrad. And I met a scientist who came up to me at the end of the talk, and he said, my name is Larry Dill, and I, like to introduce myself, and you know who I am. And I knew the name, and right away I recognized it was actually Robert Baird's PhD supervisor um, at SFU. And him and I went for coffee, and we ended up hitting it off. And he's been my mentor ever since. And the paper we just published together, he's a co-author, and he's actually on my supervisory committee too as well. So it's quite interesting. He's kind of brought me up in behavioral ecology.
Now behavioral ecology is a different it's a difficult study to be in, like a different from a research perspective. A lot of the times, especially with I know behavior happens with orcas, and it's interesting to research behavior, but it's really hard to quantify it, right? In terms of like, when you have, like when I was in school and I did my master's, I was looking at marine protected areas and how big they needed to be and what, the statistics were like, this is the composition of the demersal fish and this is a composition of the invertebrates. That's what I was looking. It was almost like definitive quantitative data. With behavioral, can you get quantitative data, or is a lot of it just through observation? And how much more difficult is that to do from a scientific perspective than it is to do quantitative?
Yeah, so it's a bit of both. I mean, behavioral ecology's come a long ways since we used to call it ethology. But like the paper we just published now is actually quite quantitative. So what we did is behavioral ecology is now kind of ingrained in a lot of different fields. It's very interdisciplinary because everything that an animal does, if it's not in its habitat or if it's social structure, it's all kind of behavioral. So for us, we looked at foraging behavior and we use focal follow data to actually collect percentages of the different types of behaviors that we were seeing. And we looked at percentages of food, percentages of time in different parts of the habitat, and then we used the geospatial analysis to look at the entire habitat that killer whales were in. And we were able to quantify that and make inferences based on the behaviors that we were seeing. So that, in a
Gotcha.
way, brings the behavioral ecology into the quantitative world, which is like what's the most exciting part. You can always tell someone that's a behavioral ecologist from others. Like you get a paper that's from like like a standard ecologist. It's like 6 pages long, and there's like a paragraph is for discussion. And a behavioral
Yeah.
ecologist, it's like 20 pages long, and there's like 90 pages of discussion.
Is there a lot of like, is it a lot of like caveats and like, if this happened where we have to assume that this is happening, is that what it's mostly of?
Yeah, and like what we propose and what we see and what we believe and like what we. So for instance, like in our recent paper, I thought what was really cool is that the transient killer whales that we're studying in Monterey, which is off the central coast of California, they hunt a
Yeah.
particular way along a canyon. But the big question came to our brain is like, well, how do they know how to follow a certain bathymetric contour of a canyon that's like 300 meters beneath the surface if they're not communicating or using localizations? So we came up with these wild ideas like, oh my God, they're listening for water that's being upwelled along the canyon, and that's been said for common dolphins. So stuff like that, like like
Yeah.
behavioral ecologists. That's kind of how we think and kind of how we go by it.
And well, I guess in that case, you almost have to be very creative and just sort of open your mind to a lot of different possibilities that could happen, because you just never know, especially with these animals, you just never know what they're going to be doing next or how they're going to behave in a specific area. So did you have that creative side, or do you agree with that? Like you have to be sort of creative and a little bit more open-minded when you're a behavioral ecologist. And then where did you get that if it's true, where did you get that creativeness from?
Yeah, so that's exactly true. You have to be very creative, I think, and they can get you into trouble in journals for sure. Because a lot of times reviewers are like, "Well, you can't make that inference based on that thought process." So, that's the nice thing about having books and things like that. But a lot of times now, it's my inspiration came, like I said, from Baird's writing. I really thought some of the ideas that came out of it. For instance, there's a lot of killer whale papers that have been published. Killer whales have been studied extensively, but a lot of it, the papers I've read were the same old, like like the same introductions, the same, this is how research is done. And then when I started reading some of these more behavioral focused papers, like with Baird and Dill, I started to get really cool ideas, and they were coming out with potential thought processes that I had not thought about, and then I started building off of that with my own thought process. Like, I wonder if this is what's happening. Like maybe there's a prey flooding of harbor seals in a particular area. That's maybe why transients are doing things like this. And that's kind of where I just kind of fell in love with behavioral ecology and realized that, being able to think like this keeps your brain going and gets you continually excited about your field.
Yeah, 100%. I think even just being able to talk about killer whales and studying killer whales, that must be quite exciting, to be able to see these animals. Like, do you ever get, how we always take things for granted after we see things for a while? Do you ever take like seeing an orca or a pod of orcas in the wild? Do you ever take it for granted sometimes? Be like, oh, that's just another orca, or that's a behavior I've seen like hundreds of times, or you're just like, I can't believe I'm doing this. Like, pinch me. I must be dreaming.
Well, actually, it's the opposite because I find with whale research on killer whales, one of the things we do is just finding them is like you're going to go for days when you're out in the water and you're not going to see them, and you're looking and looking and you're spending hours and hours, and it's cold and it's miserable, and you're just like, oh, where are they? But then suddenly when you find them, it's like this spark comes in. It's just like this excitement. And I remember when I was whale watching that, I worked with guys that were like, because there is very much a difference in behavior between the types of killer whales, with the residents and transients. But I remember guys I'd be working with, and they would absolutely like, oh man, it's just transient killer whales again. They're so boring. And I was like, always just gung ho. And they're like, because the transients are down for 7 minutes, you don't see them, and they're just slowly going, and they're not doing anything. But then suddenly, within like 2 minutes, they're suddenly on a Dall's porpoise, and it's a high-speed pursuit, and the whales are breaching 20 feet through the air, and they're chasing this porpoise, and it's water's exploding, and it's like, then you remember, like, yeah, if just patience, and you get that photograph. If you get into photography, it's just I'm addicted.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it gets quite exciting. Now you've mentioned transients a couple times, a number of times, and then we mentioned resident populations before. Can you just, for the audience who are not familiar with these populations, can you just kind of give us the difference? And then I'm going to ask some questions based on your choice of choosing transients and over resident populations. Can you just kind of give us the difference first?
Yeah, sure. So there's in the North Pacific Ocean, we have three ecotypes. So an ecotype is basically a genetically distinct foraging group. So resident killer whales, which eat salmon, they specialize in foraging on salmon, and fish form a genetically distinct population or grouping. Then you have transients, which are genetically distinct from residents, and they specialize in eating marine mammals. Um, and then we have this other one called the offshores, which primarily eat fish and occur in offshore waters, but they're also genetically distinct. So all three of these kinds of
Mm.
killer whales do not interact with each other or associate, but they still live within the same waters, but they're almost on their way being separate species or are separate species.
So how does that? Do they ever cross over? Ever run into each other in the wild? Have you ever seen that happen, or has there
Yeah,
been instances where they have?
I've seen close interactions between transients and residents, where I've seen them on basically the same heading, coming, head to head, and they'll just kind of avoid each other. They'll kind of go around each other.
Right.
Often the transients will give the residents quite a wide berth.
Okay.
The residents live in these bigger pods of, family pods, matrilineal pods that are a mother and, three to four generations of groups. Where
Yeah.
transients, it's the same social structure, but there's one or two generations, so they're much smaller, groups of four to
Gotcha.
five.
Okay. And are there differences in, like, I know you mentioned like they're genetically different, but would you be able to tell the differences when you see them? Like, are there differences in sizes or males and females or so?
Yeah, so the first, real distinction was by a scientist, a biologist named Michael Big in 1970. He kind of defined resident and transients based on association patterns as well as their distribution. And the residents live in these bigger pods, but later on, that's where resident came from, is that they were very resident to a particular area, where transients kind of transited through an area and
Yeah.
were kind of unpredictable. But later studies really found that they were different genetically, but also acoustically. So they sound very different. They have vocalizations that are very
Mm.
different. And then morphologically, which is how they look. So, for instance, transient killer whales morphologically are a little larger in size. They have very pointed dorsal fins in many ways. For adult females, their saddle patches, which is the gray area by the fin, of how we identify them, is large and gray, where the resident killer whales sometimes have what we call an open saddle, which has black pigments that enter into it. So there's a bit of a designer look. So there is differences, and when we start to see differences in morphology, that means there's an evolutionary bell going on, saying that there's something different genetically going on if they're not interbreeding and sharing those characteristics.
You've chosen transients to study. Why transients? Because a lot of the times when you see news, a lot of it's on residents. I mean, obviously the southern resident population is extremely endangered. I'm not sure if they're in Canada, but they are endangered. North is doing okay from my understanding, but why? But they get in the media a lot because of their history and so forth. Why transients for you?
Well, it's a bit of interesting. It has to do with their ecology mostly. I grew up watching a lot of National Geographic. Well, like watching lions and wolves, and
Yeah.
I have what every boy has at the age of 8, Jurassic Park syndrome, where you like to watch other things, eat other things, and I was fascinated by hunting behaviors, social predators. So
Mm.
transients, for instance, have the ability to really demonstrate foraging behavior and hunting behavior because they're hunting big prey. So you actually get to see the dynamics of what's going on in group hunting, because the prey is being killed at the surface, and you get to visually see the workings of how whales coordinate. Resident killer whales are fascinating in their own right, but the difference with resident killer whales is that most of the predation and their foraging behavior occurs beneath the surface. So
Mm.
it's often, you see a killer whale kind of quickly change directions. The resident will quickly change directions, make a lunge at the surface, and that at the end of that, you see a bunch of scales at the water surface, and that's pretty much the gist of it. but
Yeah.
like everybody in killer whale, there's so many different specialists in killer whale, research and what they're interested in. Some people are interested more in social structure. And that could be the reason why they're more into resident killer whales, because resident killer whales have such a complex social structure with these matrilines and really stable pods. So that's kind of how I got into it. I was very much interested in the group dynamics and how they coordinate and socialize and how they forage.
Okay. And now your research program is around behavior transients. What is that focused on specifically?
Yeah, so it comes down to more observations. I mean, that's the one thing scientists, ecologists in general have is, making these inferences based on some sort of initial observation. And for me, it was an observation I had for my this is for my graduate studies. I was out on the ocean, and I'd gotten used to photographing and identifying a lot of the transient groups that we saw off of southern Vancouver Island. And um, for me, I when I was out there one day, I was watching a group of five killer whales kill a California sea lion, and
Mm.
I then was kind of like, "Oh, this is interesting." And then a fisherman called me on the radio, and he said, "By the way, I've got a group of 30 killer whales heading your way." And I was like, "Oh, this is great! The southern residents are coming in because they hadn't been seen for a couple of days." And when the killer whales got there was more transients. It was a huge group, and within the
Mm.
group were animals I didn't recognize. And I found out a couple of months later that they were actually individuals from California. So right away, I was like, well, what is going on here? What's the population dynamics? Where are they found? Is there differences in their social structure or their cultures? So when I met Larry Dill at the end of my UVic degree, he had introduced me to Andrew Treitz, who's a marine mammal scientist at UBC, who invited me to do a master's degree in graduate studies with him, and I graciously accepted, and that's where we've been going. We have three big chapters that we're looking at, both fine scale and large scale behavioral differences in transients.
And so what made you go, like, what made you decide I'm going to do a master's on this? Like, you've been doing research for quite some time. Um, and was that with your nonprofit, with your friends? Is that what I mean, you did that for quite some time before you did this master's, right?
Yeah, it was with that, and it was with working with professors at UVic that were very supportive, and at Camosun College that were would provide funding here and there and support through getting publications. And but I found that there was something lacking, and the master's degree, when I started talking with Andrew Treitz and Larry Dill, was a way to get the experience in academia and research that I was lacking. And
Mm.
now I'm at the end of it. I really truly see the mentorship and how I've developed as a scientist. I've learned how to navigate politics and things that I never thought about.
Yeah.
And navigate a lot of the intricacies of publishing, and it's been very, very helpful. Now I feel very confident in many ways that when I come out of this, I'm able to feel confident in submitting a paper and dealing with reviewers
Yeah.
and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the big driver for me. Also, it's easier to get a job, so that too as well.
Now, you're coming to the end of this. Obviously, you still have to defend, and there's still a lot of stuff to do, and don't want to jinx anything.
Yeah.
But after when you do become successful, do you plan on furthering that graduate work and into a PhD, or do you find, you've got your master's, you've got that experience, you can go back to what you were doing before, and you already have a lot of the collaborations that you've been building for the last number of years. Do you going to continue doing what you're doing with that knowledge at your helm?
That's a tough question. And it's getting closer and closer with each day. I think the big thing is, the master's, the difficult part with any kind of research in academia is funding. Funding is a real tough thing, and I know we didn't really have the funding to do my research at the time. So while I was kind of in between my degrees and getting into this graduate work, we realized that we needed to substantially get, a lot of funding. So I actually joined, at the time, I was actually working for Lindblad Expeditions National Geographic, and I was traveling around the world and doing expeditions for marine mammal expeditions in Antarctica and the Arctic and Mexico. And I had met some pretty cool people, and I had heard rumors that researchers and stuff that took these jobs can fundraise and have opportunities to try to like help the research. And I was doing a talk on killer whales in Antarctica. I was in the Antarctic Peninsula, and I was doing a talk, and I was like explaining kind of the issues with fundraising and that. And this one gentleman, and his wife were so friendly. They walked up and said, "Hey, you want to come join us for dinner tonight?" And so I graciously accepted and had dinner with them, and they said, "What do you need for your research to, get this off the ground?" I said, "Well, one, we need a boat. We really seriously need a research vessel." And he said, "Okay, we'll buy you one." And I was like
You're
blown away.
kidding.
Yeah, no, no, that's a
Just
true
like
story.
that.
Just like that. I mean, we got it in a couple of months. It took us a couple of months to get
Of
through all the
course.
details, but they bought the research vessel for us. And this is before I actually met Andrew for the research. And then Andrew
Right.
accepted me, and I had this boat, and he's like, "Well, we need more funding." So I kind of just like, gritted my teeth and just messaged this guy and was like, "Look, I have this great opportunity. We're doing this amazing research." I kind of explained to him what we're doing. And him and his wife are real kind of conservation people. And he said, "Okay, I'll fund your research for the 2 or 3 years." So he did that as well. And boom, I kind of just really left off. Now, thanks to him and his organization, we were able to um, publish a lot of papers. We were able to get a lot of studies done,
Yeah.
probably close to 4 papers published, like big reports, government reports.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's the hard part. So for me next, if I'm going to do the PhD route, which I have been thinking about, it would have to deal with finding the funding. But I have a study in mind, so it's a project I'm kind of developing, and if it will be done as an independent study or an academic
Yeah.
study, we'll have to see.
And I think it's really interesting when you come to this, because I mean, obviously, you got your master's not right out of your undergrad. You worked for quite some time. Do you find it different, doing it? I mean, obviously, you didn't do it when you graduated from your undergrad, but do you find like you did it at the right time? Like, are you happy you waited to do your master's? Because some people will do it right out of school. Like I waited a couple of years, and I was glad I did. Are you happy you waited the however many years? It was it 10 years, maybe more, to do your master's after you graduated than to doing it right after? Like you had more of an idea of what you wanted, maybe?
Yeah, I think I did. And I'll be honest, like my undergrad was horrible. I mean, I met some really great people, but I was not a very good student. I
Right.
really was interested in everything I was learning, but I
Yeah.
didn't like taking courses. I wanted to write papers. Like I was like, oh, let's just throw me into a master's degree now. Like I don't. So getting to the bachelor's was I struggled, but when I got into the master's, like I found my rhythm. I knew where I wanted to
Yeah.
be, and now I got to admit, like I think the experience I have now, I wouldn't trade it for the world. It was one of the best experiences I've ever had.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I think, obviously with the maturity, but also the experience of doing research too. I feel like, when I did my master's, it was the first time really doing a research project kind of on my own with a mentor, but really a lot of it was left to your own vices and, that organization, that mindset you had already been through your own studies. So you kind of had the way you worked, how to, go about planning it out and looking at the different models to use and things like that. Right. So I can see that experience really coming in handy throughout your masters, because you may have had to like modify it a little bit, but for the most part, you had your own process, you're on your own workflow. It probably made that a little easier. And then obviously the motivation changes too when you're older. You're like, exactly what you want going into it. And you have a little bit more of a foresight into what to expect. Where for me, I know for me, my master's, I didn't have a lot of like what to I didn't know what to expect and so forth. I just know I needed to do it because I wanted to get jobs in it. But I like that. I like that idea. Now you did have one thing that the original reason why we came here to talk was the designation of protected status for orcas in the state of Oregon. And that really kind of got me to a point where I was like, for some reason I was surprised by it. One, I was surprised that it hadn't been done before. And two, that it was a state sort of protection and not necessarily a federal, because I know they're federally protected. Why is it important for Oregon to designate, these orcas protected in Oregon in state waters?
Well, the Oregon coast is an area I've been very interested in for a long time, and we developed a lot of research down there in the last few years. We started up a pretty extensive monitoring program, and it's really gotten the local population, the people in Oregon, very interested in killer whales, and that's never been really the case. Gray whales have been really the focus. Oregon is a gray whale
Right.
place. Everybody studies gray whales. I mean, they're there all summer, every day. But now we're starting to realize that killer whales are a key component. And southern residents, the Oregon coast is super important because it actually has the largest salmon population for southern resident killer whales that contributes to their diet, which is the Columbia River. The Chinook salmon population that comes off the Columbia River is crucial to southern residents. Um, and a lot of the fisheries management that's mandated, even though it comes through NOAA, a lot of it through the National Marine Fisheries Service, is also policed as well as governed by the states. Washington State, for example, has protection, endangered species protection for southern residents. So now that we're starting to get more information through research and surveys showing that southern residents are moving their way down the coast, even as far as Central California,
Mm-hmm.
that we're going to start seeing more of these designations. And what you asked the most why this is important, um, I think that the fact that salmon is critically endangered, Chinook, a lot of Chinook populations are critically endangered, and that the state has so much power when it
Yeah.
comes to fishing and to resources. I think it just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I think also, we said it's federally protected and now it's state protected. I feel like it's important to have both of those designations because boundaries matter in conservation. Not from a species, they don't care about boundaries, but we do in terms of protection. And before we recorded, Josh, I was telling you about hammerhead sharks in Florida, how they were protected within state waters in Florida, which is I think the 9 nautical mile out to the 9 nautical miles from the shore, but they're not protected federally. So fishers can, like recreational fishers can grab, hammerhead sharks out in federal waters, but not in state waters. So not that there's a fishing pressure against orcas, but those protections matter in different waters. And that comes down to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, like some of the pressures are like, ship strikes or shipping along the West Coast. What others like dams and things like that. Are those all, I mean, that's obviously to the Chinook salmon that they eat, but all those have kind of an impact on their population, even recreational whale watching boats whale watching boats and recreational fishers. Maybe what are some of those threats that matter for those? Are there any others that I missed, or are those threats, and how can they impact them?
No, that's a huge one. Overfishing is a big one. We know that fish stocks are, and with climate change, is changing a lot of things. We know that the ocean currents are changing. We know that fish populations are declining all over. There's been plenty of studies and models. And you were right, and and whale watching could be a huge issue too. I mean, vessel noise is a big problem,
Yeah.
um, and we don't really know enough about it. Even though it's increasing in a lot of places, there's more companies,
Mm-hmm.
more boats, and I think the other thing too is pollution. Pollution is another big thing. I know there's been some new papers. There's a killer researcher in my department, a scientist that just published a paper on pollution and killer whales and different kinds of new insidious toxins, the stuff that I've never even heard about that are entering into killer whale blubber and into their bodies that are just disruptive to their endocrine system. There's a lot that needs to really be looked at. And the one thing, nice thing about having the Oregon State as well as the federal government, NOAA, both having the southern resident killer whales as endangered is that it makes it easier for state and government and federal to work together.
Right.
I feel like that's a huge benefit because they're both on the same page. There's no argument. I mean, I'm sure there'll be political differences, but there's not going to be as much arguments over what needs to be done when it comes to protecting these animals. And one of the other big concerns, what people don't really think of, is hatchery salmon.
Mm.
I personally, I'm not an expert on hatchery salmon, but from what I listened in at the hearing for the southern residents and what I've done, talked to colleagues that are in fishery sciences, is that the actual quality of hatchery Chinook isn't as good as the wild, which means resident killer whales need a certain amount of food to meet their energetic and caloric intake. Where if they're just
Right.
getting, if the hatchery's out competing the wild, then they're going to be getting less nutrients from hatchery salmon.
Never thought of that. That's actually a really good point because we don't think about that from what they're used to. Is there a sort of like a future threat? There was a paper that came out, or an article that came out, not a paper, but an article that came out. I think it was CBC, maybe even in the States, talking about air quality in Canada has gotten worse just with wildfires. obviously wildfires on the BC coast has been an issue for quite some time. Is there a threat from sort of the chemicals in the smoke that are coming off of those wildfires into the ocean? Is that a problem in the future, or is that a problem now, just with like getting into fish, getting in? Because I know with when we talked about mercury and say like tuna, right? We know that a lot of it's coming from coal dust that has been used from fossil fuel energy. Is this a problem that we're going to see, or are we already seeing some of that problem or some of those chemicals in orcas right now?
Yeah, actually, that's a really great question, and it's happening. There's a paper by my colleague Juan Jose Alva, who's at the Institute for Oceans Fisheries at UBC. It just got published a couple months ago, so pretty recent. That actually highlights, like I said, these new toxins, these new
Yeah.
pollutants, and one of them was from wildfires. So it's already being seen in the tissue of killer whales. Um,
Wow.
so yeah, I don't know the complete gist because I'm not a toxicologist in any means, but
Yeah.
he's a great guy and he's always open to talking about these issues. And he actually just did a presentation that's on YouTube at the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries YouTube. That his whole presentation, a whole 45 minutes about these particular issues um, with or not charcoal, with ash and whatnot's coming off of
Right.
coming off of trees and fire. It's a significant issue.
Yeah. It's something that will definitely need to be more researched more in the future, because obviously these wildfires, unfortunately, don't seem to be going anywhere, and apparently they continue on in the winter too, which is kind of scary if you think about it. But let's move on to, like, thank you for that. I appreciate the information on that. You just said before, and I kind of want to highlight this. You just had 2 papers published recently. Are you up for talking about those briefly, if that's okay? I
Absolutely.
know you've been doing
Absolutely.
press on it all day, so I
Oh, no.
appreciate it.
Oh, it's all good.
So let's talk, like, pick which one you want to start with, and we can just talk about it briefly.
I think the evidence for the oceanic population sounds pretty interesting.
I think
I'd like
so.
to talk about that one.
Yeah, for sure. So can you just kind of give us a breakdown of the paper and give us a gist of it, and I'll ask questions based on that.
Yeah, so we have a paper that just came out on mammals, which is it's a great journal. It's one of the oldest marine mammal journals known. Um, but it was really cool. Our paper is based off an observation, multiple observations, but the first ever report in 1997 was a large herd of sperm whales that were encountered um, 200 kilometers off the California coast. And during the encounter, it was actually the famous cytologist Bob Pittman actually encountered them. And um, these sperm whales were being attacked by killer whales. And it was a herd of female sperm whales, and there was a group of 35 killer whales. And he took photographs, and in the paper they talk about how these killer whales are kind of unknown. They had cookie cutter bite marks, which I'll explain to cookie cutter shark guys, but they were
Yeah.
just unknown. So, and later on, we started to pick up more and more of these observations from our own field work, as well as from a lot of the observations we were having when we were counting transients off California and Oregon. So that's kind of where this paper goes, is that we took we did a big review plus all the observations we had of these encounters with animals that did not fit the description of typical killer whales like residents and transients that we were encountering off California and Oregon. And we developed and looked at a potential new oceanic population.
That's that is so cool. So for you, like, why is it important to do the paper on this one? Like, why was it so important to get it out there? And I don't know why it just exploded on my video. It does that every once in a while. I gotta figure this out. It's exciting. It's exciting.
Yeah. I think for us the excitement is that for me the open ocean is kind of my favorite ecosystems or habitat. It's kind of the unknown, of Star Trek, The Last Frontier. Like it's a really cool ecosystem that is untouched in many ways because we just can't access it to do research a lot of the times. And hearing about, we've seen so many killer whales that, we studied a lot of the transient populations and the residents, and we recognize them. But for me, an unknown population out there that could be on the high seas is kind of intriguing. It's mystifying. And then for me, that goes into questions like, what are they eating and what are they doing out there, and where are they going, and So now what we found in this paper is that these killer whales were predominantly, we identified 49 of them. I'm up to 70 now.
Wow.
Yeah, the paper just got published, and we're already up to 70 animals. They're unique because they were eating marine mammals, which differ from the offshore killer whales that eat fish or sharks.
Mm.
Um, that's a particular genetic ecotype, as I mentioned earlier. These killer whales occur also in offshore waters or in the high seas, but we're only seeing eating marine mammals. I think there was one sea turtle that they were witnessed
Okay.
eating, a leatherback sea turtle. But other than that, um, they are not known. They resemble transients in many ways, but the most significant factor, what we found was that almost all individuals, I think there was only two that we didn't see it, but almost all individuals had cookie cutter shark bite marks. So to explain for the viewers what a cookie
Mm.
cutter shark is, a cookie cutter shark is a small, like dogfish looking shark that uh, has a really, really nasty attitude. It's basically a parasite that goes up to large vertebrates like tuna, large whales, and they have these little mouths that are like raspy, and they take off big chunks of tissue. You're a
Yeah.
shark guy, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I do. You know, to be honest, I live by the Great Lakes, so I always think of like sea lamprey. You know, they got that round mouth and it gets digs it, but these are bigger and it really takes a good pound of flesh out, right?
Oh, some of the killer whales we saw had like fresh wounds, like pink,
Oof.
red, like nasty wounds, and then some of them had like older ones that had healed that were gray and black. But these sharks are only found in deep, deep oceanic waters that are between, I think, 18 degrees Celsius and around 25 degrees Celsius. And that really
Okay.
gave us the indirect evidence that we needed to say that these whales, in particular, spend their time in the open ocean, and that we've never seen cookie cutter bite marks on any of the coastal animals. That gave us that like this is probably a unique population we're seeing.
Have you been able to get close to get so to be able to get like a genetic material from them or get a sample from them yet?
That's the next step. It's funny
Okay.
actually. I actually had a great discussion yesterday with Phil Moran, who's a geneticist who studies killer whales. He's written some pretty amazing papers. One's coming out
Yeah.
next week, which will hush hush, but it's looking at new species of killer whale. But he and I have had a chat, and we're both very interested in me getting out there, getting the samples to send to him, because what that really shows is that we don't really know at this point where the boundaries of a population genetics changes. So we
Mm.
don't know where the transient genetics stops and begins. Like where's
Yeah.
the boundary? So this could be a boundary. Being in the open ocean offshore could be a boundary for the change in the genetics from one ecotype to another.
That's quite exciting. I'm being very calm here, but like I have butterflies in my stomach to be like potentially a new population, pretty far out in the high seas. And as soon as you said high seas, I was thinking of this new high seas treaty, you know, for help extra protection. You know, this could be a reason to protect this area, you know, for this type of population, depending on how many there are. And, you know, obviously it's going to be difficult to tell if the population is going up or down when you don't even know the extent of the population at this point. Obviously, there's at least 70, potentially more. Um, but this is exciting to be able to find a new population, potentially, you know, genetically different. Uh, when you first see that, like, where do you begin? You know, to be like, how do we sort of, do you just go with the description, like the major high like overview, like sort of like the high level type of information on it, and then start asking the questions and seeing how you can answer? Because like being on the high seas, probably not easy to study. You know, if one, you got to find them. Two, you're not dealing with clear conditions all the time, I assume, you know, being in the high seas. So where does that go from there? And again, that's thumbs up. I don't know where that comes from. It's just my
No,
hands
that's all
moving.
good. No, so the first thing I think of when I get a report sent in, and which is really exciting, is we get first thing I look is location. Where was the report taken? If it's really close to shore, maybe off of Vancouver Harbor or off of Oregon, like near Newport, I'm thinking it's someone we know. It's probably a transient that we've seen before or a resident of some sort of killer whale that we know of. But if I get a report from, say, 50 nautical miles offshore or, 100 kilometers offshore, I'm going like, right away, my spidey senses kind of go off and I'm thinking, this has got to be something interesting. The second thing I do, thing. I've run that pictures of those killer whales. I'm really crossing my fingers. Someone's got a good photograph out there that like of a killer whale that's got like a good shot of the dorsal fin, that saddle patch, and then I run that right through a database of about 1,000 killer whales that we know, mix
Mm.
like of residents, transients, and offshores, and almost 90% of the time it's something we don't know. And that right there is super cool. Once we don't know what it is, we give from our research group in California and Oregon, we give it a new catalog number. So that's we give it a new catalog number, and then we start to look at other things like who was the whale with, where was it spending its time, and then like we just catalog that, and then we hope to God we get more encounters. We've only had in our paper we only had one resighting of two whales from oceanic waters.
Okay.
One was 300 kilometers off California, and then the other was then the whales were re-seen again 175 kilometers off of Oregon. So that's kind of we're hoping for more resightings. That's a big thing to kind of show the distribution.
Of course. That is insane. It's so cool. That's so exciting to be able to see that. So obviously being published, no wonder you're getting asked, to be on CBC and things like that, and getting a number of interviews, including this one. So I appreciate that. As people are listening to this, they are trying to kind of figure out ways. A lot of people are like, man, I want to study orcas, or I want to study whales, and I want to get into that. You've obviously, Josh, you've always had a passion for it, where you were studying them no matter what. As an independent scientist, as a master's student, as a marine mammal biologist on, as part of expeditions, doing talks and, whale watching, and probably the marine biologist on the whale watching. You've always had that passion for it. So what advice would you give people who are listening to this, who want to say, this is all good. Like, there's obviously a lot of questions that need to be answered. Not everybody can do it all. How can I get into, studying orcas, whether it be in BC or just worldwide? Because there's questions all over the world for these orcas. There's all the stuff that's happening in the Strait of Gibraltar, just outside of that. There's the stuff that's happening in South Africa with Port and Starboard, who are going in and, having their fill of great white shark livers. And obviously this new population that you potentially have discovered in the oceanic waters. What advice would you give for people to go? And would you recommend the same way you did it, in terms of going at it yourself and just observing and studying, or what advice would you give?
That's a great question. It's something actually my partner and I were talking about. I was talking to her this morning about it, and because I had somebody approach me going, like, how did you do this? Like, how did you get, and like, I think it's difficult to say. There's two kind of ways that you could go by it, and it's not without hardship. There's the one way you go is
Mm-hmm.
like what most people do, like a lot go the academic way. They finish their high school, go into their bachelor's, do a master's or a PhD, and get their, join an organization somehow, get your resume. Um, that's one way to go. I found, though, for me, it was a lot of differences in my personal life with my family, with the people I knew. Um, and what I wanted to do, what the questions that my philosophy of what I wanted to discover. I'm a scientist by education, but I also wanted to go by it a different way, and it wasn't easy. It was years of like volunteering my time and struggling financially and doing all that stuff. Like, I mean, it was brutal. Forking out gas money for your boat just to go watch whales, and like traveling to do things like it wasn't. It's not easy. And I think if I could truly say now where I'm at, I feel that it's been a long time, but I feel like at this point I feel pretty comfortable that I've kind of made it in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
I still find that I don't think I'll ever not find that I'm still trying to push through and into the field. Um, and that's what I would tell people is that if you're going to do something, it's not just it's not easy. You gotta push for it. You gotta fight for it. You gotta really spend your time trying to get to that point that you want to work, and especially in killer whales or any sort of marine mammal research.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think we have similar paths in terms of my communication and sort of doing things the way I've always envisioned, and you doing the same thing with orcas and marine mammals is doing things. You have questions and you want to discover them, and it may not fit within a specific organization or may not fit within a specific academic institution, and you got to kind of push forward. It's not easy, but we appreciate the transparency and the candor on that. But thank you so much for that. And again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We'd love to have you back and talk more about orcas and transients and this potentially new oceanic population and all things marine mammals. It'd be great. Thank you so much for coming on. It'd be great to talk to you again about it.
Yeah, and Andrew, I hope we'll get you down to Monterey on a boat trip one of these times.
It won't be hard. Twist my rubber arm. That sounds good. All right. Thank you so much, Josh. Really appreciate you. Stay on and we'll chat. Thank you, Josh, for joining us here on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was wonderful to have you on. Can't wait to talk more about orcas and research and behavior of orcas, and maybe potentially more new populations or discoveries within that population. Very, very exciting. Love when I get to talk about not only just like marine mammals, just ocean species, but discovery and research and why it's so important. Just goes to show you that there's so much more we need to discover. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the end of the episode that you heard, where we talked about, I asked Josh to give us his advice in pursuing a career. Now, one of the things that I love about the job that I'm in and the ability to interview a number of different people is I found a select few people, including Josh, as well as myself, that are very common, that are trying to build new paths because we love what we do so much and we can't really find where we fit in within sort of the marine careers field. And we're trying to sort of figure out our own path. And, a lot of it looks glamorous and cool and fun that you're doing your own thing. But it can be very difficult, just as Josh mentioned, it's very, very, very difficult to sort of blaze your own path because you're trying to do new things. People don't understand what you're trying to do. They may not like what you're trying to do and say, well, if we're doing this, why can't you? And it can be very difficult from just sort of like your own confidence perspective. You're trying to drive through, and a lot of times you want to quit and you don't. And it seems to have worked out for Josh, which I really like to hear. And it's working out for me as well. Don't you worry about me. I'm enjoying what I do. And I think, there's a sort of a mindset where we have to fall within these boundaries, and you can go outside of those boundaries, and it will be difficult, and it's not going to be something that's going to come easy, but it can really help when you really look at it down the road. And if you're willing to endure that hardship at the beginning, there could be something at the end if you continue to work hard. It's not for everybody. I'm not going to say it's for everybody, but Josh, it's definitely for Josh, and you can see the passion that he has for not only research of these orcas, just the orcas themselves and talking about what it's like to see the orcas and all that wonderful stuff. It's really cool. I really appreciate Josh being so transparent and telling us all about it. And I'm so happy that you got to hear it right from his mouth, and it was just awesome. And congratulations, Josh, on discovering this potential new population. I look forward to hearing more about it. We're going to put links to see Josh on social media and connect with him. But I want to thank you for joining us and listening to this podcast. If you like this podcast, if you like the episodes that are coming out, and you think someone, maybe a colleague, maybe a friend, maybe a family member, a fellow student or fellow marine biologist that wants to listen to ocean conservation content, please feel free, or actually just share it with them. Just copy it, send them the link and say, hey, you need to listen to this right now. But thank you again to Josh. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can do so. Actually, here's the thing. I want to talk to you about something. I want to connect with you. If you're a fan of this podcast, you've listened to this podcast for quite a long time, even if you've listened to a few episodes, I would like to have 5 minutes of your time to get on a Zoom call with you, have a conversation about the podcast and what you think about the podcast. I just have a few questions. I want to get to know you. I want to get to know my audience a little bit better and how I can serve you better with content and with just things surrounding the podcast and my business. So feel free to look me up actually, I'll put up my Calendly link for like a quick 15-minute chat, and we'll have a chat, and I'm looking forward to that. But thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of this How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.